Good. Do we have any introduction of bills? Seeing none, we'll move on to our next agenda item, but first, I would like to welcome Senator Pittman to the Commerce Committee. Welcome. We might bark, but we don't bite, so jump in. Okay, committee, we are continuing our hearing on SB 347. Yesterday, we were unable to hear from one of our proponents, so we're going to give him that opportunity this morning to start us off. Eric Stafford, Vice President of Government Affairs from the Chamber. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, Senators. Eric Stafford, Vice President of Government Affairs with the Kansas Chamber. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Glad it worked out that this continued. Sorry we had a bill up in Senate Judiciary yesterday, and I was waiting, and it was finally taken care of at the very end. So about the time I got out of that committee, I saw the representatives from Department of Commerce walking downstairs and figured missed our shot. But glad we have the chance to be here today. You know, last year this committee and the legislature did a lot of good work modernizing and updating, making changes to the state's HPIP program. HPIP and PEAK are really our top two incentive programs out there that are most utilized from the business community, most utilized to attract investment in the state. And there are, in a perfect world, we don't have incentives. We don't live in a perfect world. And so until all 50 states agree to disarm, to offset the higher above average tax burden that we do have in our state, which we talk about in various committees, we need to have incentive packages available for economic development investment purposes that are attractive and competitive with especially our peer states, neighboring states, but also nationally and globally. Just read an article this morning, opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal that Iowa governor just announced a bold tax plan to go to a flat rate on personal income taxes and drop their corporate rate down from, I think it's 9.75 or 9.78, to get that down to 5.5. Individual tax rates down to 4%. So their governor is wanting to be very aggressive on the overall tax policy for their state to attract investment. We must continue to do the same. So the proposal before you dealing with the Apex mega project, I think it's taking combinations of PEAK and HPIP to attract a large employer, a large investment, and then also potentially their suppliers and subcontractors who might supply to them. There are some comments or questions, concerns over, you know, are we going to poach jobs away from existing Kansas employers? You can make the argument that that's happening with existing incentive programs for existing Kansas-based companies today. It's a competitive marketplace when we're in a situation in a workforce climate that workforce, how many times have you heard that in this building over the last 12 months? It's only gotten worse. There just aren't the bodies and the number of people available to replace a retiring workforce. You have COVID, you have changes in workforce dynamics. So there's already a competition. So it's kind of a chicken or the egg. Do we want to ask people to move here without any opportunities, or do we want to create the opportunities that provide the opportunity for people to move here? You probably have to do the latter. Now's a good time. California's run out of U-Haul trucks that are moving out of the state, and they're having to ship more back. So people are looking to leave states that have high regulatory or high tax anti-business climates for better opportunities elsewhere, whether it's Texas, Arizona, Utah, North Carolina, Tennessee, and we're competing with those states. So there's a good opportunity here to have a significant investment, probably the largest I've seen in my time at the chamber here. You know, whoever it is and whoever Department of Commerce is working with, you know, at least we're competing. That's the good news. Overall, they went into the details yesterday. This largely resembles peak and HPIP, but it's very unique. There are oversight and clawback protection provisions for taxpayer protection purposes. But again, you know, we in an ideal world don't have incentives, but nothing's ideal. Appreciate the Department of Commerce bringing this forward, and Madam Chair, for you allowing me the opportunity to speak today. Glad it worked out, as I said earlier. So happy to answer any questions you all have.
Questions for Eric from the committee? If I wait long enough, I'm sure someone will think of something.
You did.
Oh, Senator Stephan.
Thank you. One quick question. You know, we walk through new programs year after year after year. Is there any program that would be too much for the Kansas Chamber, or are they all acceptable to the Chamber?
I think you have to look at the return on investment, and that's one thing we've said before to various committees. Excuse me, sorry. Whether there was a bill dealing with economic incentive reviews back in 2018, I think it was. Representative Williams had introduced it. We worked with her to adopt some standards from the Pew Charitable Trusts on accountability. So, you know, if these programs aren't working, then yeah, let's review and get rid of them or change them to make them better so that they do work. But I think if you look at some legislative post-audit data back in, I think, 15, maybe 16, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but some decent numbers on peak and HPIP. But in terms of, is a plan too big? I mean, I think from the initial investment and, you know, in terms of a incentive package, what you're giving, you got to look at the amount of investment that's being made. Obviously, this is a pretty unique circumstance that's not your typical, you know, 75 to 100 job investment or growth expansion project from an existing business that's here. I think it's very unique. So the return on investment of the jobs, the people that'll be here, the income taxes they're paying, the houses they're buying, the growth. I mean, we got to do something to grow. That is what we're saying all along. That is what our Vision 2025 plan is about. What can we do to grow the state? We have to change course. And so is it too big? Well, what's the return on the investment? I think that's what's worthy of calculating and taken into consideration. So, you know, if there's a positive ROI, then seems to be good.
Yes, Senator Stephan.
Can you calculate the return on investment of this project for us quickly?
It's probably a question for Department of Commerce.
I would love for you to do it if you can.
Well, I am not privy to the project that's being negotiated right now, so I probably can't.
So you don't know what the project is?
I can't say that I know what it is, no.
Thank you.
Other questions?
But to that point, I know there were some comments about that yesterday. I think that, you know, we have elected officials, the administration, their employees through the Department of Commerce that are elected and appointed into these positions to be trusted to perform on behalf and to the benefit of the taxpayer. And if they're not, then there will be results in accountability. But, you know, I think it's not unique for these to remain confidential up to a certain point. So that doesn't necessarily give us concern because oftentimes you don't hear about anything until the deal is finalized or close to being finalized. But that's where you all come in to hold people accountable to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not being, you know, wasted or disposed of in an inappropriate manner by the administration.
Senator Pittman, then Senator Ware.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here, Mr. Stafford. You know, I wasn't here yesterday. I apologize for stepping into the middle of this hearing, But, and I'm going to take advantage of your time here, just to look at it from your perspective as a conglomeration of businesses in Kansas, looking out for the best interest of often rather large suppliers to other businesses in Kansas, agribusiness and other types of business. And I just think from your perspective, would you agree that this is kind of an interesting approach in that it's looking at a supply chain of businesses and incentivizing a total footprint of businesses, not only the mega business, the initial investor, but also a series of other suppliers that could be current businesses as well, to incentivize them to supply that other business. It appears to me to be quite unique, and it seems something that the chamber would be quite excited about, of attracting even those supplier businesses in, and maybe disincentivizing them from moving over to, say, Missouri or something like that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I don't remember who I was talking to the other day. That's actually one thing I felt like was the most unique about this bill, is that it is dealing with not just the one company, but suppliers to that industry. See how effective it is. Maybe that's something to look at. I know there's some reluctance on incentives again, but maybe that's something to look at in terms of modifying peak and HPIP in the future, that could potentially go down that path. But again, you got to look at, just reiterate, look at the effectiveness. I think peak and HPIP have shown that they are effective. HPIP especially, you are requiring a minimum investment, especially in metro counties, of $1 million. So, and to qualify, peak is discretionary from the secretary. So yes, you can keep up to 95% of the withholding taxes, but those are all negotiated by the Secretary of Commerce, and most of those from the tax professionals that we work with have said most people are not receiving that full value because it is negotiated, so they're not getting up to 95%. So again, there's some discretion within the Department of Commerce already as exists. I think these programs have shown a positive return on their investment, which is what we're looking at. But again, just reiterate the fact that we have talked, many of us have talked over and over and over about wanting to grow the state and wanting to attract investment, and you have a great opportunity here to grow. And again, chicken or the egg, we got to have the opportunity for jobs in order to attract people to come to our state. So hopefully this is a good catalyst of things to come in the future. So,
Senator Ware?
Thank you so much. He actually answered my question in the process, so thank you.
you're welcome.
Okay, Senator Peck?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Going back on your institutional knowledge, we have 347 before us, and we were told that this is urgent. We need to get this passed by the end of the month. Do you recall in recent past or long past where the legislature's had such a major piece of legislation that we were told we need to get this passed within less than a 2-week period?
I know that there have been some very time-sensitive bills before. I don't recall if any of them were incentive-related. I'm not 100% certain on that, but I know there's obviously been time-sensitive bills before, but yeah, I don't know if it's ever been related to a, pending project that's been out there. I'd have to go back and look to see if we have anything on record on that.
Okay, I could not recall any in my 14 sessions either that were incentive. I've seen some others, and we've got 2 of them on the floor today. And then another question, and my final question for this conferee, Madam Chair, is we were told that since 2017, there have been 11 mega projects that looked at Kansas, and we received none of them. Are you aware of what they are? I guess I'm questioning why, if we've had 11 over a 5-year period, why haven't we looked at something over the last 5 years rather than all of a sudden we've got this one and it's urgent to get this legislation passed? So do you know anything about those 11 mega projects that were looked at?
No, Senator, I don't. I'm sorry.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions from the committee? I do have one. Eric, you mentioned that we have to be competitive. I agree 100%. We have to be competitive to grow our state. You gave the example of a state that is using that return from these mega projects to lower the corporate income tax rate and individual income tax rate for all of the citizens of that state. So my question is, if we don't have that built into this bill, how competitive are we with states that are making the entire business environment more attractive throughout the state rather than relying on a single project?
Well, yeah, I think those are, they're not mutually exclusive. Incentive packages and, even Texas that doesn't have income tax is going to have I think at one point, maybe 5 years ago, I don't know what they're up to now or where they're at. I mean, they had $750 million in cash that was their deal closing fund to say, what do you need? You need $50 million? Boom, here you go. Here's a check. That's tough to compete with. And a strong tax climate, a competitive tax climate, it's not either or. Incentives still are part of the marketplace. So in our view, you have to have both. That's part of the conversation about comprehensive tax reform with Senator Tyson's committee that we're going to hopefully be working on in the next 12 months to 24 months about corporate income tax rates, personal income tax rates, sales tax, property taxes. I mean, the amount of work that her committee was able to do last year on the property tax front that you all passed and became law with truth and taxation, I mean, that all helps. So it's gradual. You can't do everything at once, and so you just have to kind of slowly chip away. But I would argue that tax rates and incentives, they're not an either or approach. It's a combination of all of the factors that matter toward making our climate attractive. Infrastructure is important. Quality of education is important. Access to highways, access to broadband. I mean, all those factors play into the decision of a business on where to locate or where to expand. And I think we have a lot of good things to offer. We need to continue to sell it and promote the great things about our state. But yeah, there's some things that you all as policymakers should consider in addition to incentives that can help improve the climate too.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for accommodating me. Thank you.
Yes. Committee yesterday, Senator Peck did have some questions for the Department of Commerce, Mr. Hughes. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead with the proponent questioning and give Senator Peck and others a chance to address those questions. So welcome back, Mr. Hughes. Senator Peck.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I appreciate that. Since we have had a delay or an extension of time, I've had an opportunity to actually read most of 347. And some of the questions that I have, it appears to me that we are going to be reimbursing total payroll costs paid to qualified businesses of up to 10% of the total payroll per year for 10 successive years with no cap. Am I reading that correctly?
That's the maximum extent of it, that the way you've stated that, but it can and often will be less than that.
I understand, of course, it can be less than that, but it can be that 10%. And I would be curious to know what that fiscal note would be at 10% for 10 years. Also, it looks like we're going to have up to a cap of $5 million for 50% of training and education eligible expenses, which includes travel expenses, meal expenses, hotel expenses. And so if we're going to give them, because we're establishing funds in the state treasury, is that money coming from a particular fund, or is it just going to be appropriated by the legislature from state general fund dollars? Do you know?
Much of those funds, the employer, that's a reimbursement program. So they're spending the $10 million first and driving taxes through those hotel stays and dining and whatnot to be able to reimburse those funds. It's also the reduction of the peak program from the potential 95 down to 65 that's also contributing to that program.
So there's no dedicated funds. In Section 6, it talks about establishing in the state treasury the attracting powerful economic expansion payroll incentive fund. So this would just be established, but there's no dedicated revenue source. Is that my understanding? I understand what you said, that there should be extra money come to the state treasury because of the payroll taxes and so forth. But I just thought that I would ask, because it looks like to me we're giving away other taxpayers' money to this particular entity or other entities that may decide to locate in the state of Kansas.
I can get specifics on the funding source for that, Senator. I don't have that complete picture for you today.
All right, Madam Chairman, if I may, I've got one more question for this conferee.
Yes, Senator.
Actually, I've got several, but I'm going to limit it to just one. You said in your testimony that, and I asked Mr. Stafford, and he was not aware, that since 2017, Kansas has been considered for 11 mega projects. None have been built in Kansas. My question would be several, but you can just answer whatever you wish. I don't know who they would be. Where did they land? Why did we not have legislation put forth prior to this legislation? If we've already lost 11 projects over 5 years, I would think, well, hey, we need to make some changes. And then all of a sudden, we're given this piece of legislation saying, we got to get this done by the end of January.
Senator, regarding the history of at what point is this too painful and we have to do something? I can't speak to what took place in the state 5 years ago, but it is this project that does have a timeline attached to it that drove the decision to look at this. I'm relatively new to the organization. I joined in October of last year. It was one of the very first things I looked at. I was brought forward to Kansas to be the headquarter hunter. And in looking at what the state's history was, to me, it stuck out like a sore thumb. We don't have the right tools to go after these kind of projects.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Any other questions for Mr. Hughes? Senator Stephan?
Thank you. I think it was you I asked yesterday, we talked about how you came to us with one solution and there's always multiple options of solutions, and you said you're going to work on something to help us understand what our other options are. Were you able to accomplish that?
Yes, I provided those figures to our team. It was around 11 o'clock last night. As of this morning, they were finalizing those. You'll have those today.
What time?
Okay, before end of day.
Any other questions? Senator Pittman?
Once again, I'm sorry I wasn't here for your testimony yesterday.
All right.
Could you just in less than a minute, just let me know, has any other state done something as close, a very, very similar model in your experience with these mega projects? And has any other state really looked at it as a supply chain footprint like we're doing here?
Thank you for the question. It mirrors a question that we received yesterday. It was similar to that. And we're, in addition to Senator Stephan's request to do that illustration, we were asked to also create a chart of other states that have mega project programs. At last count, I saw at least a dozen other states that have those. And as far as I'm aware, I'm not aware of any that include the supply chain footprints that go with those. It was a lesson I learned in our work with the TSMC in Arizona, which is a semiconductor company that was insistent that we come up with something to address the supply chain as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Seeing no other questions, thank you very much for coming back today and
Chair.
standing for questions. Committee, I do want to draw your attention to written proponent testimony. We have Blake Schreck, President and CEO of the Lenexa Chamber of Commerce, Matthew Godinez, Executive Director, Southeast Kansas Regional Planning Commission, Eric Brown, President and CEO of Salina Area Chamber of Commerce, Deborah Tufel, Greater Hutch Economic Development, Hutch Chamber President and CEO, John Jenks, Director of Public Policy, the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce, Blake Flanders, President and CEO of Kansas Board of Regents, Blake Benson, President, Pittsburgh Area Chamber of Commerce, Gregory Kendall, President, Wyandotte Economic Development Council, and the Kansas Economic Development Alliance. So those are available for your reading. Next up, we have Dave Trobert. Dave, thank you so much for staying over and being willing to come today and provide us your testimony. Welcome to committee.
No problem, Madam Chair. Thank you for the opportunity. For the record, Dave Trarbert, CEO with Kansas Policy Institute. Madam Chair, members of the committee, we appreciate this opportunity to talk about this issue. It's a pretty controversial one, and before I get into some of my testimony, I want to ask, maybe some of you have seen an AT&T commercial that's playing pretty heavily right now. A little girl is given a lollipop by Lily, the AT&T attendant, and then her brother gets a really big lollipop, and the little girl says, "Hey, that's not fair." Well, it's not. And that really that stuck in my mind when I started writing my testimony. Because what we're doing here is saying one company that allegedly doesn't reside in Kansas is going to get the whole lollipop, and the thousands of companies that have been here paying taxes don't get anything. You know, just that 15% refundable tax, now that we know it's a $4 billion investment, 15% of $4 billion is $600 million. Can anyone remember how much the total corporate income tax is in Kansas? Happens to be $600 million. So we could give one big lollipop to one company, or we could wipe out the income tax liability of all the corporations in Kansas. And that brings up one of the problems with the discussion on return on investment. I've never seen one economic development proposal that honestly examined return on investment, because you have to look at what that money might do if not spent on this, because it would be spent on something else. So for example, if you wiped out the corporate income tax liability of all the Kansas corporations, well, there's a return on investment on that. They don't want to talk about that because it dilutes the message. I mean, my testimony, I just was guessing at what it might be, and now that we know the numbers, I reran them last night. It is, now we're up to, I think it's $900 million that this just the mega project company would get. I mean, look at it. You get 15% of $4 billion, that's $600 million. You get 10%, I know it's all up to, but you have to make the judgment on, because I'll bet you the return on investment is calculated on the max. 10%, I think it was 4,000 employees, $50,000 average, that's a $20 million payroll. If you get 10% of that over 10 years, that's another $200 million. And then there's the withholding you get to keep. And I don't know how to calculate what we're giving up in property tax revenue and sales tax revenue. But that's $900 million that, if you want to look at return on an investment, you have to look at what else would happen to it. You know, the tax foundation, Mr. Stafford was talking about being competitive, and Senator Erickson the same way. Our corporate rate of 7% is higher than 29 other states in the United States. Ironically, I had in my notes to mention the Wall Street Journal story today, and that brings up, property tax. Kansas, according to the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, Kansas has the 15th highest effective property tax rate on commercial and industrial property. And if you think that's bad, we are the worst effective tax rate on commercial industrial property in rural Kansas. You know, the best thing that government could do to encourage economic growth is to remove barriers to economic growth. That doesn't cost anything. Reducing taxes, reducing regulations, all the barriers that those site selectors would also identify. And it's just that we have to look at all of these things. Another one, where are these employees going to come from? I doubt they're going to all move here. They're going to come from existing, most of them probably from existing employers who are already struggling to find employees. This now makes this employer, it's again one of those competitive advantages, because someone who's getting all these incentives can afford to pay more. It's going to make it much harder. What if we don't know where it is? What if it's in an urban area? How many of those employees are going to move from rural areas and further exacerbate that problem? What if it's on somewhere along the Missouri border? How many of those people maybe work here but still live in Missouri? That has to be certainly factored into the return on investment. You know, I know that people are calling this a game changer, but I wonder how many times the legislature has been told things like PEAK and HPIP and STAR bonds were game changers. And if those all worked, why are we now in our 5th straight decade of economic stagnation? We still have these problems. And now the next one I want to bring up, PEAK, by the way. I think it was Nathan Jensen a few years ago did an analysis. He was at the Washington University of St. Louis. He examined the Kansas PEAK program, and his conclusion is that PEAK recipients were no more likely to create jobs than non-PEAK recipients. STAR bonds, I mentioned in my testimony. Dr. Art Hall at the University of Kansas looked at 2 STAR bond projects in Wichita. And basically what he found, which is what we expected to find, is you create a new, in this case in Northeast Wichita, you create a new economic zone, it's just going to shift activity. So are there more jobs there? Sure. Where'd they come from? Where did shopping come from? A lot of it from other parts of the city. It's shifting it around. Now, it was mentioned yesterday that there's a lot of at the discretion of the secretary language scattered throughout this bill. It's basically trust us. Well, I forget exactly when it was, but it was for 2000, the governor and the Commerce Department announced that there had been a $2 billion capital investment and over 8,000 jobs created in the year 2000 because of all these economic incentives and all the hard work. And I know they're all working hard. Well, media didn't ask for any documentation for that, but we did. And you know what we were told? The first time we asked, show us how you arrive at this $2 billion investment. Well, those are all based on pledges. And if they're telling the truth, that means they don't know how much was really invested. Then we submitted an open records request for the methodology. And the response was, no such documents exist. This bill gives Commerce far too much discretion. If there's anything that we've learned over the last 2 years working the way through the COVID, it's that a lot of Kansans are suffering because of too much government discretion to decide who's a winner and who's a loser. So for these reasons, we would encourage you to not approve this. And with that, I'll be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Trobert? Senator Ware.
Good morning. You were comparing the ROI of the individual companies, existing companies, versus the ROI for, in this case, what would be the whole state. Is that correct?
No, I was comparing I was talking about how the return on investment is calculated. And the return on investment in every economic development proposal I've seen in this state and others never accounts for how that money, what that money would do. In this case, about $1 billion. What if we let companies and Kansas individual taxpayers keep $1 billion more? What would that generate? That part of it is never examined.
It seems to me that that would generate something pleasant for the individuals involved, but it wouldn't benefit the state as a whole.
Well, I guess it depends on how you define the state. Because if it benefits all the individuals and it benefits all of the companies, how would that not benefit the state?
Well, we're not talking about all the individuals. We're talking about the specific ones, the smaller companies that you were worried about, the existing
Oh,
companies.
but you could. You certainly could. By reducing the marginal rates on corporations and on individuals, because a lot of those businesses, the pass-through businesses, are paying at the individual rate. And those are also much higher than most of the country, a good bit of it anyway. And so if you reduce marginal rates, then everybody benefits. Everybody benefits. So if that's the definition of how the state benefits, then I would contend that the state does benefit from that.
Senator Steffen?
Thank you. I was trying to take notes on, again, go over the numbers on what this program could cost for this one project in comparison to our corporate taxes again, please.
Sure. So if and it is kind of interesting that that wasn't provided to the committee because it's not a difficult calculation. Maybe, I mean, the numbers are scary. There is up to certainly a 15% investment credit. And if this is a $4 billion investment, 15% of $4 billion is $600 million. And without a dedicated revenue stream, that's coming out of the general fund. It might go to another fund and get paid out of that, but it's coming out of the general fund. Then if you say they are allowed to keep 10% of the payroll, get reimbursed, well, they said they're going to create 4,000 jobs at an average of 50,000. 4,000 times 50,000 is 20 million. Or 200 million, I'm sorry. 10% of that is 20 million. And you get to do that for 10 years. So 20 times 10, $200 million. Then you get $25 million over 5 years for training and education. And so now we're looking at $825 million, and we haven't touched property tax revenue or sales tax revenue. Then look at the qualifying suppliers. Pick a number. Pick a low number, $500 million that these qualified suppliers collectively would invest. That's $75 million, 15%. If it's $1 billion, now you're at $150 million. That's going to those collectively to those suppliers. They get other kind of subsidies. You can pretty easily get this over $1 billion. It's just for the supplier, for the mega qualifier alone. It's really easy to identify $825 million without sales tax or property tax. And so, I mean, think about it. What do you think your constituents would say if you went to them and said, we have $1 billion to spend, how shall we divide it? I wonder how many of them would say, give it to one company.
Senator Tyson?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for your testimony and your presentation. I would also ask you about the examples that you gave. It doesn't touch on the fact, you did talk about how it will impact the coffers, the state coffers, but the bill is also refundable. Meaning, and I know you know what that means. I'm not sure every committee member here understands what that means. So would you like to talk to that?
No, refundable means, and that's why it's, you take the, whether it's a reduction of the tax revenue they have or the income tax that they would pay, And I believe someone mentioned yesterday that they probably wouldn't have much of a tax liability initially because of depreciation. That's why it's a refundable credit, because that means you write them a check. And that check has to come from somewhere. If you're refunding a portion of payroll, you have to write a check. You didn't get any money in. You're writing a check.
Yes, Senator Tyson?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you. Follow up. We keep hearing ROI, return on investment. We never hear, did they do a cost benefit analysis? That's the bottom line. And we never hear that terminology. Let's talk business, guys. I'm all for it. In IT, we absolutely do those analyses before we go through with a project. And I think that standard should be also applied to economic development.
Yeah, because, and you're absolutely right, Senator, looking at the return on investment, if you want to look at it just what would come from this project, then you look at what would that money do if left within the economy. And the cost benefit analysis is comparing the two. And you make a judgment call. And there's no right or wrong answer. You have to make a judgment call. Another challenge with this, $1 billion, 800 million, whatever that number is, you're probably only going to do that one time because you're raising the ante. And while this is, I think, partially being hoped to be a game changer, we are not going to win. A state like Kansas cannot win an economic development war where the biggest checkbook wins. There's a lot of states that have bigger checkbooks, that have much bigger capacity to give money away. And giving money away is something you do when you can't otherwise compete. So, and I would agree with what Mr. Stafford said. We would not propose that you just unilateral disarmament. We understand that as long as the game is being played, you probably have to do something. But you have to have, we don't have enough that we could give that would make that difference. What we could do, though, is remove barriers to economic growth. That doesn't cost anything, and that is something, that's part of the reason that so many businesses are flocking to Florida. They're flocking to Texas. It's a much better environment for them and for their employees.
Okay, final question. I'm sorry, Senator Pittman, and then we need to move on.
I think I'll be brief. Mr. Trevor, have you ever had a job as an economic development person in a government entity?
No, I haven't, but I'm a recovering accountant. I know how to look at numbers.
Oh, you do.
And I certainly know how to analyze the state finances, and we work with a lot of economists.
Sure. I get that. And, sometimes when you have a linear spreadsheet and you do add the numbers up, and you don't necessarily divide that $1 billion over a 10-year period, it does add up pretty quickly. We are operating in a competitive market. And while you might not feel we can attract businesses in Kansas, I think we can. I think that's not a very good argument necessarily, but I understand your points. We can't compete with Texas when they have $750 million in cash to give away. And it might not be beneficial to Kansas to even try. But from what I understand, we have listened to the folks that have put these investments in. And I think you'd probably agree that investment in Kansas from external businesses, wouldn't you, that that's a good thing for the Kansas economy? I think that's a pretty straightforward, simple statement.
It depends where it comes from, Senator.
But the investment coming in and providing jobs is something that I think that even your institute would agree is a good goal for Kansans to have. We don't want to just have people fleeing, right, the state?
We have had people fleeing the state. We have had companies fleeing the state for a long time. And we've had game-changing incentives in place for a long time.
Sure, Mr. Trevor.
When you look at a return on investment.
If you'll let me just go ahead and continue.
Oh, sure.
Thanks. you know, in my district, Senate District 5, we have urban outfitters come in and invested, and we're looking forward to those jobs. And I know that those jobs could have come across from Missouri. They might be coming in, but we are excited about having that there. And it's going to have, it's a bit of a game changer for the whole KCK area to have that revenue, those jobs, and those opportunities revitalizing that urban district. And it is a very good program. The Star Bonds have worked there. Absolutely agree. In other places, when you look at just 2 incidents of Star Bonds implementation, like you mentioned, you might not get a very good return on investment on some of those. Couldn't agree more, but we have seen it work. And so I just want to put a counterpoint in there that it's not always in a vacuum that we can make these numbers and have these numbers add up like you're doing. Sometimes it's about growing the pie to be a bigger pie. And sometimes we have to look a little bit longer than the 4-year horizon. I know we've tried to reduce the corporate tax as an economic development tool in the last 10 years, taking the LLCs down to 0% rate, and didn't have necessarily a whole lot of success about attracting businesses in here. You know, there are options out there, but I absolutely appreciate you looking at the numbers as you have done. I appreciate the voice of accountability that you bring to the table. Might not agree with all the conclusions you come to, but I really do appreciate your work.
Well, thank you, Senator, and that is our role. Frankly, obviously, we're the only ones here offering a different opinion on this for your consideration. And while I readily admit I'm not an economic development professional, neither are you. And so you need this information that to make a fully informed decision. And sure, it's easy to point to something like Urban Outfitters and say that works, but of course it depends on your definition of work. What are they selling at Urban Outfitters that's not already available for sale in your area? And so people will go there and shop, but they may not shop somewhere else. Wichita.
Just on that point, that's a distribution center, not a store.
Okay.
So it's a national distribution center for logistics and things, and so it's a core infrastructure type location.
Yeah, it's like we had a distribution center in, where was it, in Montgomery County for Amazon. They left. We had a game-changing incentive for Cerner. We know what's happening with Cerner. And so it really matters how you define what works and for what length of period, and what else would you do? What would be the return on investment? What's the cost benefit analysis of using the money one way and not another?
Okay, thank you. We could, I'm sure, consume the rest of today on this subject. We'll have to end there. Committee, if you do have additional questions, please get those submitted. I'm going to speak for the conferees in general and say I'm sure that they would welcome any questions or clarification you might have. So with that, we're going to close the hearing on SB 347. We do have about 40 minutes remaining, so we're going to divide the time for the LPA post-audit. And the first topic we have are Star Bonds. So Andy, is Andy here? Take about 20 minutes, so committee, have your questions ready. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is the second in our relatively recent series of economic development incentive evaluations. We did one on angel investor tax credits that we released a little while ago, and then Star Bonds we released in August. So the statute that directs us to do these evaluations gives us quite a bit of latitude in how to approach them, and so we try to approach them in a way that we think makes sense given the particularities of the program involved. And you can see in the introduction on the inside cover that we have tried to answer 2 questions about Star Bonds in this particular evaluation. So the first one is whether current Star Bond attractions satisfy the Department of Commerce's tourism-related goals. And then the second one is how long it'll take the state to break even on tax revenue it gave up supporting 3 selected Star Bond attractions. Now, on that second one, we recognize that the Star Bond Act does not include a break-even analysis as a suggested or required way to evaluate this program. Our act, however, does direct us to consider fiscal impact, and so that's really the intent of that, to look at the fiscal impact of giving up sales tax revenue on the front end to help support the repayment of STAR bonds, and how long for 3 particular STAR bond districts that we evaluated it'll take for new revenue that's generated by those districts to kind of backfill that amount. Now on page 3, we have a bit of background information. In the interest of time, I'll go over this pretty quickly. So the legislature first approved this program in 1993. And these are bonds that are issued for economic development, particularly to help finance tourist attractions within development districts that local governments have created. And they're used to pay for things like property acquisition, site prep, and infrastructure costs. After 20 years, generally these are supposed to be repaid, and then all of the sales taxes that were previously going to repaying the bonds are collected by the state and local governments at that point. At the bottom of page 3 and on to page 4, you will see kind of an overview of the program and how it's been used since 1993. So as of November 2020, which is when we evaluated the data, you can see there that $1.1 billion in STAR bonds have been issued to support 20 attractions in 13 districts in 12 cities. You'll see at the bottom of page 4 that Kansas, to our knowledge, is the first state to create a program like this. A couple of other states, Nevada and Illinois, created similar programs that appear to have been modeled on Kansas, but they don't appear to have been used since 2010. Now, getting into the answer to our first question. Now, this is the big bold text on page 5 right in the middle. And as a reminder, the first question was whether current STAR bond attractions satisfy the Department of Commerce's tourism-related goals. We estimate that only 3 of the 16 attractions that we reviewed met Commerce's tourism-related program goals. Now, the act creating this program really broadly defines its purpose as the promotion, stimulation, and development of the general and economic welfare of the state of Kansas, including Kansas communities. But the rest of the act makes it fairly clear that that economic development is really envisioned to be stimulated through tourism. So that's why we wanted to look in particular at whether these attractions are drawing tourists. If you flip to page 6, there's a couple of sub-bullets there that outline the 2 goals that the Department of Commerce created for this program for attractions. You can see that each attraction should draw 20% of visitors from outside of Kansas and 30% of visitors from at least 100 miles away. And that's important because drawing people from outside the state to bring their money to Kansas and spend it in Kansas injects new money into the state economy. That wouldn't have been there otherwise, and so that's an important goal. That's clear-cut sort of new revenue for the state. Now you'll see at the bottom of page 6, and then on to page 7 and 8, the Department of Commerce didn't have data about this, about whether the attractions that it's approved are successfully drawing tourists. So we went with a private company that was able to provide us with objective, third-party, reliable, location-based data, so we could see whether these attractions are successfully drawing tourists. We looked at 2018 and 2019 in particular, and we limited it to attractions that were open relatively early in 2018, so they actually had an opportunity to draw tourists. We excluded 20 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. You'll see figure 2 on page 9 that only 3 of the 16 that we looked at successfully met Commerce's goals in either 1 or both years. So you can see that in Hutch, the Underground Salt Museum met both goals in 2019 and 1 of the 2 goals in 2018. Heartland Park met both goals in both years, and the Kansas Speedway also met both goals in both years. And this Heartland Park maybe seems a little bit surprising given some of the financial difficulties that district has had, but this is purely looking at whether it's drawing tourists and not whether it's able to generate sufficient revenue to repay its bonds. On page 10, you'll see in figure 3 pretty heavily rounded contextual numbers there. So we wanted to provide you with some information about like what 20% means or what 30% means, 20 or 30% of how many people. We're a little bit less confident in our data source, Streetlight's ability to tell us the absolute numbers of visitors. We're more confident in their ability to identify where those visitors are coming from proportionally. And so this is really just context to give you a general sense of when we say 20%, kind of what that means, 20% of how many visitors overall in general. In the middle of page 11, we have kind of our takeaway of these results. So it seems to us that it's sort of those more unique attractions that are doing a better job of drawing in tourists. So the Salt Mine Museum is the only one of its kind in the Western Hemisphere. So people really have to come to Kansas to get an experience like that. The Speedway is a NASCAR track. It hosts, major racing weekends and is doing a good job of drawing in people for that. And then Heartland Park, it hosts national level racing events, competitions, and appears to be meeting the goals through those types of events. At the bottom of page 11 and at the top of page 12, you'll see that there are other ways to think about a program like this. And one of them is, concrete local benefits that these types of attractions, even if they're not drawing a lot of tourists, are probably providing to their communities. So these are things like quality of life. They're providing new, interesting amenities for people who live locally and are primarily drawing locals who are apparently interested in taking advantage of some of those things. They probably create jobs, stimulate capital investment, things like that. But we wanted to look at the thing that really makes this program unique in terms of setting it apart from other types of economic development incentives that also stimulate some of those same types of things, but don't have the same tourism focus. Okay, so middle of page 12, you'll see our answer in the big bold text to question 2, which, as a reminder, was how long it'll take the state to break even on tax revenue. It gave up supporting 3 selected Star Bond attractions. Now, this is not like a comprehensive look at the financial or fiscal effects of the 3 districts that we looked at. So we can't really say with certainty whether these are overall good investments, bad investments, they were the right things to approve or not. We simply wanted to get a sense of what it meant for the state to forego, or in some cases lose sales tax revenue to support these particular districts. And so we just looked at the sales tax and how much was given up on the front end, and then how long it'll take the state on the back end to recoup that through what we would identify as truly new sales tax revenue that's being generated by these particular districts. So this is not like an overall ROI or return on investment, but it's more of like a look at the opportunity cost associated with this. So we've been hearing a lot about opportunity costs this morning, but the state chose to forego sales tax revenue for these districts. Could have used that money on something else. So to get a sense of how long that type of opportunity cost is maybe going to persist into the future, just for this selection of districts, we wanted to get a sense of what it really means to give up that kind of sales tax revenue. So you'll see on page 13 at the top that we looked in particular at the Underground Salt Museum in Hutch, which I've already mentioned, the Overland Park Prairie Fire District, and the Wichita Sports Forum District. We chose them because they're pretty typical Star Bond districts. They introduce what we thought was some interesting variety in the types of attractions and their locations and how far they've gotten in repaying their bonds. We didn't look at Village West, which is of course the one that everyone thinks of when they think of Star Bonds. Village West is an outlier. It accounts for 2/3 of all the bonds. It is in a large urban area. It is really not representative of the program in general and most of the types of attractions that have been built with this program. So we wanted to look at kind of the more garden variety districts and not look at Village West, which we didn't think would give us a good sense of the average district. So you'll see at the bottom of page 13, there's a couple of assumptions that went into this. We have a fuller treatment of our methodology in Appendix B at the end of the report. But as with any economic development study or analysis, there are simplifying assumptions that have to be made in order to make the analysis doable. And there are two here that we wanted to point out because we think they're important in terms of understanding the results. So the first one there, you can see that we assumed only out-of-state visitors bring in truly new revenue for the economy. Economic research suggests that when a local person visits something like a star bond district or really any other business, if that thing weren't there, that attraction, that business, they probably would have spent their money somewhere else in the state. And so to the state, there's no net gain with that. So as an example, if a family was going to have a birthday party at the sports forum in Wichita, which is one of our 3 districts, but the sports forum didn't exist, they would probably have the birthday party somewhere else. So it's not necessarily the case that the sports forum's existence stimulated new spending that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So that's why we only looked at that out-of-state visitation and assumed that all those people are really being attracted by the district and spending new money in the state to the state's benefit. We also assumed that only development that happened because of star bonds brings in new revenue. So some of this development would have happened anyway. That's probably a safe assumption for, let's say, the Overland Park Prairie Fire District. It's in a very rapidly growing affluent area. And in our conversations with the Overland Park officials that we talked to, they also thought it was probably going to develop anyway, maybe later on than it did with star bond support, maybe in a slightly different way. But some of that development would have happened anyway, even without the program. And so we tried to just hone in on the development that we think is really being induced by the program and is sort of that new development that we can really attribute to the existence of the program.
Andy, due to time, is there any way you can kind of wrap up, summarize in about 5 minutes so we have time for a few questions?
Absolutely, I can do
Thank
it in less than 5 minutes. I can do it in just maybe 1 here. So if you go to the top of page 14, you'll see the results. And I would draw your attention particularly to the 2 bold lines there. There's a range there of a minimum and maximum break-even year. So this is the year or the range of years that we think will be required for all that sales tax revenue to come back in terms of new revenue to the state. And there's a range because this requires things like predicting the future, and it requires things like assuming what would happen if star bonds didn't exist and these areas would have developed in different ways, and how people would act in the absence of something like the sports forum, like where that birthday party would be, for example. So those ranges, and they're imprecise because of that. But really what matters here is less so the particular years, but more so like how far out they are. So you'll see that the sports forum that I've mentioned a couple times, those years are the closest in, so it's probably not going to take quite as long for that new sales tax revenue to be generated and equal what was given up. And then the Hutchinson Underground Salt Museum, you see those years are the furthest out, and so that's going to take longer and maybe is not as strong of an investment from the state's perspective. So it's really sort of how far out they are versus how close they are. More so than the particular years. Now, on 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18, there's more detail about the districts, there's maps, there's more information about how we made our decisions for these particular districts. We also had a couple of recommendations, one to the Department of Commerce, that they use some of this data to shape future decisions about whether to approve newly proposed attractions. And then we had one, you can see this on the top of page 20, as a suggestion to the legislature to maybe consider amending the statute to clarify the goals for this program. So if there are particular visitation benchmarks that you're interested in seeing, that would be one thing. If something like, local quality of life is really an important outcome of this and is something that you would like to see, you're okay with, mostly local visitation, clarifying that in the statute is something you could consider as well. So. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Andy. In committee, I do want to make note that you will see, starting on page 20, there is a Department of Commerce response to the audit, as well as additional information in your folder from the department about their response to the audit. And I want to thank Bob North, who is the Chief Legal Counsel for the Department of Commerce. He is here and available to answer any questions that you may have of him regarding this as well. So with that, I will open it up for a few quick questions before we move on to our next presenter. Senator Pittman.
Thank you, ma'am. One question, and some of the response from the Department of Commerce. They say that maybe you shouldn't have used just out-of-state sales tax revenue. And given that sometimes, and I understand that you took a narrow look at tourism as the metric you chose to go with, not necessarily using some of the common economic development terms like time factor of 6. When you invest here, it has a factor of 6 impact on the community, used to justify projects like MCI's refurbishment and other things like that. Understanding that you chose to look at this and you feel like this is the sole unique aspect of the STAR bond is the tourism part, but also understanding that to attract external, I mean, it's obviously easier in my district on the east coast of Kansas to attract people to come in from across the border, and that's an out-of-state visitor if they drive 20 minutes versus some of the internal places. Do you, I mean, what do you have to say about that, that it is a particularly narrow evaluation to calculate an ROI, isn't it?
Well, so I do want to be clear that we did not calculate an ROI.
I meant cost-benefit analysis.
Sure. Well, and I would even say it's not really a full cost-benefit analysis.
Payoff of the 44 decades return,
Okay.
how long it takes to get back the money the government's invested. I'm sorry if I mischaracterized that.
So there are, obviously, as I mentioned before, we looked at one particular piece of this to really understand what it meant for the state to help pay off, let's say, $65 million in bonds for Prairie Fire. What does that mean in terms of the sales tax revenue that has to be given up on the front end to help repay those bonds? How long will new revenue take to backfill that? Just that particular thing to really understand the opportunity costs and translate it into something that's maybe easier to understand, like a number of years for it to come back rather than just a number, or a dollar figure, which is maybe not that intuitive. If we were going to do a fuller treatment of this, like maybe in a future evaluation, and we would want to look at something like an ROI, we would definitely, to your point, include multiplier effects, indirect and induced economic effects, things like that. And it would require a lot more work and a fuller picture in order to get at whether like this is a good or bad program or any particular investment was good or bad, which we are not saying in this.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and thanks for the work. You know, and I'd have some issues with some of this. I think that we could do this program better. I don't know if this is a litmus test that says it's bad or it's good, but I appreciate the work you've done.
Thanks.
Any last question for Andy? Thank you so much, Andy and Bob, for being here to address this. I know we talk a lot about this, but just wanted to, again, kind of refresh our memory on that. Committee, next we have Matt Etzel, who will be giving us a kind of priming the pump for the Kansas Department of Labor's response to COVID. I do want to also let you know that next Thursday, we will be continuing this topic. We will be having a joint meeting with the House Commerce Committee, and that will be at noon in, get you the room number, 112 North. So next Thursday, we will be having the Department of Labor also giving us information on this topic, but this will be a good primer for that discussion. So with that, thank you for being here, Matt.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I'm just going to give you kind of the 30,000-foot view of our findings, and then kind of I'll be quiet and I'll be able to answer any questions you have, or if you need me to delve deeper into the findings, I'm happy to do that. But basically, this is the findings from part 2 of our audit, looking at the Department of Labor's response to processing unemployment claims during the pandemic. It had 2 objectives. The first was to determine some of the causes for delays in processing claims here in Kansas over the course of the pandemic. Just real briefly, what we found was it was basically a combination of 3 things were kind of the root cause. So 1 were rapid changes to the state's unemployment program. 2 were historically high unemployment claims. and 3 was an ill-equipped computer processing system. So what I mean by that is that the state's computer processing system, we found that it was outdated, and the underlying code to that system was disorganized. So as the state started to experience extremely high unemployment claims over the course of the pandemic, and as the Department of Labor had to make periodic changes to that system to keep up to speed with changes coming down from the US Department of Labor, that outdated, disorganized system started to malfunction. There started to be errors. There was downtime when it wasn't processing claims. Individual claims would error out. All of those things contributed to those delays that we saw over the course of the pandemic. The second objective for this audit was to try to estimate how much unemployment fraud could have occurred in Kansas over the course of the pandemic. What we ended up finding was that we estimated about $700 million in unemployment fraud could have occurred from January 2020 to February 2021. I'm not going to get into too much detail on it, but we used a combination of things to get to that number. One was a neural network that we developed in-house. We also relied on claims data, claims that the Department of Labor had flagged as fraud as well. So it's really a combination of those two things that gets us to that $700 million estimate. And then just breaking down that $700 million in fraud a little bit further, about half of that, so $343 million, came from federal funds, from those temporary federal pandemic programs, and about half, 344, came from the state's regular unemployment, 344 million, I'm sorry, came from the state's regular unemployment program. So as far as the division between that 700 million, it was relatively split between state and federal funds. The timing is a little bit different, so a lot more of the federal fraud occurred towards the front end of the pandemic, and a lot more of the fraud for the state's regular unemployment program happened towards the tail end of our evaluation, November, December of 2020. So again, super high level review of our findings, but I'm happy to stand for any questions if there's anything I can elaborate on.
Thank you. Questions for Matt? Seeing none, if you do think of additional questions, we'll be sure and get those to Matt and Andy. So, committee, I wish you a very happy weekend. We will not meet tomorrow. I appreciate your flexibility. Please keep watching for agenda updates from Connie. As you know, we're trying to be very flexible. I appreciate your guys' understanding. And with that, we are adjourned.